So my program today and that I'd like to present is really going to deal with a lot of the topics I talked about last February, but I've kind of brought it up to date, really looking at some of the topics that I think are most have a better importance for the land information program throughout the state of Wisconsin. So I'm kind of looking at how does that program interrelate with the things that you do on a regular basis. So those of you that are involved in the world of GIS data, parcel maps, and survey maps. A lot of this is based upon my years of experience in the field of real estate, especially from a governmental perspective, and how it interacts with property issues that face a lot of register of deeds, a lot of land zoning offices, and of course, the people that are involved. So if we go to the next slide, what really it talks about, let's see, are you picking that next slide up, Laura, or should I be doing that? There it goes. Okay, so what we're looking at is we're going to define what we collectively and individually know. I mean, what the problem is so many people think they know certain things, other people really know other things, but we really have to get this conglomeration of ideas together when we're talking about real estate mapping. When we talk about what's the whole purpose of land information and to put things in their proper perspective. One of the things I've told people when I teach at the university level, and what I often tell people is you really have to take these ideas that you hear in the classroom and you've got to apply them to the real world. And so in this case, we take these ideas that we hear and we apply them to the real world of real estate property rights and responsibilities, especially looking at the people we deal with. In the next slide, we look at here's a survey map, and I just picked this one at random, and it has all kinds of numbers and all kinds of descriptions on it. And I've seen some, and I was watching the last part of the last presentation. And of course, we know we've gone a long ways from this type of a map and all the different types of maps that we can produce. But what we're really talking about here is really defining real estate property rights. Now, on the next slide, we've got a list of the property rights that everyone is looking at. And so if I were going to leave you with a concept today, what I would say is what you have to remember is when you're dealing with people and you're dealing with information, you first of all want to go to them and you want to take a look at what they're really looking at. So what are the property rights? One is the right to possess. We're talking real property, not personal property, real property. The right to possess the property, the right to control the property, the right of excluding others from the property, the right to derive income off of the property, the right of disposition of the property, and the right to exercise none of these, which is a right. You have the right to do nothing with your property too. These are the 6 characteristics of what we refer to as property rights. And this is what people that buy and sell property are looking for. They're going to look at these various different types of rights and they're going to say, what am I obtaining? What's my right of possession? What's my right of control? What's my right to exclude others? What's my right to derive income off the property? Can I dispose of the property? And then do I have the right to do nothing? Now those property rights, next slide, please. The next is, well, the fact that we alter these rights. And this is what we'll be talking about as we go look at some of the maps and some of the different characteristics of the different types of maps that we look at. Because when we take these property rights, we also have to remember that we create certain other rights. And these are the rights that take away some of these property rights that we have. The right to encumber. So in other words, I have a piece of property. I have a right to put a lien on it. I have a right to borrow money and put a mortgage on it. I have a right to encumber it with an easement. In other words, I can put something on it that allows somebody else to have a right across my property that actually is superior to my right. I mean, we have to understand the concept of the dominant right versus the subservient right, and how the difference between licenses and easements, which is very, very important. And of course, there's been a whole lot of confusion about easements and how long do they last? What's the impact? And our legislature has recently tried to bring that to resolution by suggesting that easements that say they're forever are forever, and not necessarily what the Supreme Court previously said with regard to the extent or the length of an easement. So we talk about how to encumber. Encroachments are also encumbrances. Now, encroachments are something that you may not create on your property, but you may create on somebody else's property. You may encroach on their property. And that's what we call an individual encumbering not only your property, but somebody else's. So these are just three categories. And I'll talk later on how they all come together when we talk about property rights and what we look at with the different types of mapping that we're going to talk about. Also, of course, there's government intrusion, and we're all involved with this, because how do we alter rights? Well, we alter rights by the government creating a zoning. So if we go back to the property rights and we talk about, I have the right to control my property. Well, you have the right to control your property as long as you don't do something with your property that violates the zoning code. That is the government saying to you, we're going to limit your property rights in some way. Government intrusion is also assessment. I mean, assessing your property, saying that it has this value or that value. What's the impact of that? Will it make your property more valuable, less valuable? It may discourage you from building or constructing on your property. It may easily keep you from selling your property if the assessment is of a certain level or a certain condition. So these are all things that we have to look at when we look at property rights. Finally, eminent domain, the right that the government has to take away all of our property rights. Now, they have to compensate under the Constitution of the United States and the Constitution of the state of Wisconsin. They have to compensate us fairly for the property rights they take away. But again, the government doesn't always, what's the old, the credit card, I think it was MasterCard. They always had, this is worth this is worth this, and this is priceless. Well, eminent domain doesn't have a category called priceless, but yet many of us do when we talk about our property rights. A lot of people will fight for their property rights, quote unquote, to the death because they're looking at trying to accomplish things. Finally, there's homeowners, and homeowners have a situation where they will, associations, they'll limit your property rights. You can only have certain type of lighting. You can have only certain kinds of colors on your house. You can't use your house to raise income. You can't rent it, or you can only rent it for a month at a time. You can't do a VBRO. And those are other restrictions on the rights that people have in property and the defining of the property. So next slide, please. So how does this affect land information? And how does this concept that we've been talking about really come into play in the world that we're all dealing with? And it really comes by understanding how the data is collected, compiled, dissected, and how it's communicated. That's the role that you have. That's the those of us that work in the land information world. We're the ones that have to, first of all, collect the data. And we have to collect it with those property rights in mind. In other words, if I collect data, how often can I find some property and suggest this property is a beautiful piece of property, but find out there's a restriction on the use of the property, which obviously changes some of the rights. And the data that we collect, the data from the government, the data from the homeowners association, the data from maps we'll talk about in a little bit, all of that information put together is going to help us. So we have to compile it, then we have to dissect it into different stories. Again, I was looking at some of the diagrams you had earlier, and you talk about different things you put on a property, and you have to locate where your neighbor has a tower that could collapse and fall onto your property. Does that impact your property? And it certainly does, because you have to know what is going on around you. And then finally, communication. What I find is many people do not know how to communicate the world of property rights to somebody else. They have a tendency to look at it through their eyes rather than looking at through the eyes of the person that's receiving the information. Lots of times I've walked into Register of Deeds office or in a zoning office, and they'll explain something to me and I'll say, yeah, from your perspective, from the governmental perspective, from the data collection perspective, that's all fine and dandy. But from the client's perspective, my client, or from the customer's perspective, what are they trying to find out? What data are they trying to glean from what you know or what you have available to you? Because the person that's hearing the story is oftentimes coming from a whole different perspective. And that's something you have to keep in mind when you look at the data, because selecting and getting data for data's sake or from an academic pursuit is a whole lot different than somebody seeking data as far as what they plan on doing with a piece of property. If I come in with a piece of property along a lake and I ask the zoning office, can you tell me anything about the property? And they say, oh yeah, this property is in shoreland zoning, and that means you can't develop anything on this property without, fulfilling the requirements that we have here in the county. Oh, by the way, you should know that the riparian rights are a document. In other words, you can go through all of this information, and unless you give this information some continuity, unless you give it some basis in the eyes of the person hearing it, you're really not communicating. Next, of course, is the evolution of the world of inquiries. And, how do you understand the value of that information? It wasn't long ago that no one ever asked, questions like, what's the drainage flow on this property? No one really cared what the topography of the property was. Well, they do now, and we all do now. You take a look at what are the hydraulics of the property. That's becoming a very important document that's part of the land information. In other words, where are the aquifers under this property? Where does the aquifer come from? Do I have to worry about that aquifer being contaminated because of a factory 2.5 miles away? I mean, go to Marinette County, Wisconsin, if you'd like, and ask some of the people living, outside of Peshtigo or outside of Marinette that are miles away from the factory that supposedly disposed of all the PFAS into the ground, and the impact that it's having on their property. And this is information that we, as people that are involved in the world of land information, are constantly collecting, and we need to put it together in a format that in this world answers the questions that our people are looking for. So our role is the collection and communication of data. But remember, interpretation and opinion are very different than collection and communication. And I'm going to be talking about that a lot, because this is where I find that people interpret data in such a way, or give their opinion on data in such a way that is not necessarily correct under the facts and circumstances of the person asking for the information or the person that's going to utilize the information. And that's important to keep in mind. If I go to someone and I say to them, can you please give me the GIS information that you have with regard to this parcel of land, they can give me the data. What I don't want them to say is, oh, that parcel of land, oh, by the way, you can't build on that parcel of land. Oh, do you know that parcel of land once upon a time was a dump, and that means that parcel cannot be used? I mean, that's interpretation, that's opinion. And many times that's not the role that we're in. The role we're in is to provide the information, collect the data, distribute the information. And I'll be talking about that in more detail. And if we go to the next slide, please. So understanding starts with knowledge. And one of the things is that's why it's great to come to seminars like this or go to other programs. And I'm really happy to see you're going to have the Sheboygan Boogan, or you're going to have the session over there in what I always thought was called Sheboygan, but now I understand I mispronounced it. But the bottom line is, more information you get, the better off you are. Also, to understand the conflicting information that you have. One of, I think, the best things is if I go to a GIS map, for example, for a county, the first screen that I'm going to go to is a screen that tells me that I can't use this data as evidence I can use it for what it's there for, but I certainly can't take it as evidence into a court of law. I can't take it as evidence of what I'm really telling this person they're going to be buying. That's not what it's there for. That's not what a GIS map is there for. That's not the purpose of the GIS. The GIS is there to give data. If you want to know specifics, we have things called surveys. We have other techniques that are acceptable. And those are the things you have to be looking at. And that's why it's important to understand what are the conflicting elements in determining what information should be shared. Locating and presenting information in totality is also important. You know, what I'm talking about here is don't just give little bits and pieces. Don't think you're done when you're investigating a piece of property if you just look at the topography, or if you just look at the land. And if you don't go back and check the history of the land, how did the title to the land evolve to where it's at? What perspectives are there from the state as far as controls? What governmental interventions are we looking at? This is all information that should be available in this world of land information. That's what the role is to give as much information, or at least send people to the sources where they are. And so referral is very, very important in referring to people that do give interpretations and opinions. That's the role of a lawyer. That's why we have insurance. If we give bad interpretations or bad opinions, that's the role of courtrooms. That's what their responsibility is, to give that kind of interpretations. We have certain positions within government that are specifically designed to give interpretations and opinions on land. And that's fine. Other people don't have that responsibility. Their responsibility is to collect the data and then communicate the data, answering inquiries, not giving opinion, not giving interpretation as to what the data says. That's somebody else's role. And I think it's important that people know the distinction from one role to another. Next slide, please. So this was fun for me. I looked up, and I'm sure you all know this, what is land information? Well, if you go to the statutes, it defines land information and land records. It's very clear when it defines what those duties and what those responsibilities are. They're clearly laid out in the statute as to what is there and what has to be done as far as duties and responsibilities. And the basic comment, and of course you can all read it, and I think one of the most insulting things in the world is when somebody reads you a statute. But in this case, I thought it was very important to understand that when you read the statute, it talks about the various duties, and the duties are really to maintain land records, and land records are defined as maps, documents, computer files, and other storage medium. In other words, all the data that's available out there. And you do it as a local government, a municipality, regional planning commission, boards, commissions, planning commissions, other different independent agencies, all are part of the land information system. And then if you look at duties, the duty is basically to take tax parcels, define what a parcel is, because a parcel is used for taxation or assessment purposes. It's also there to classify land as it fits together with certain federal and state requirements, as far as zoning, as far as land use, as far as eligibility for programs. This is all part of the duties of the land information, is to categorize the different classes of land, soil types, historical background on the uses of land. This is all part of land information. And then, of course, it's to maintain zoning information, address systems. As we know, our whole computerized system now that is used by dispatchers throughout the state of Wisconsin depends upon the services of land information, providing them with the data they need so they can use the system to find, look, and locate people that are missing, lots, parcels, intersections. All of that data is there. The statute also goes beyond that. It talks about how many, approximate acreage, what programs are available, what federal government, what state government programs. All of that is part of that data. And I just think it's important that people know, and some of you may not be involved with the Land Information Council or with the land information duties and responsibilities, but I think it's important that you know and recognize that the state has a commitment and our local municipal governments have a commitment, and a lot of our private industries have a commitment to try to establish a system so there's one place to go and that the information is correct, that it's been looked at, examined, winnowed and sifted until we have something we can legitimately rely on as good data. The rest of the statute just talks about funding. Next slide, please. So I'm going to now move away from kind of that overview, and I'm going to get down into the specifics of what I wanted to talk today about, which is survey maps, GIS maps, and parcel maps. They all have different roles. We're going to start with the survey map, and we're going to start with what's the role of a surveyor. Some of you are surveyors. You may be a county surveyor, you may be a private surveyor, you may be a surveyor working for a major corporation that does land development, but you know what your role is. And I think it's important to understand for people is what a surveyor is not. And this is kind of where I always like to start when I'm talking about the role of surveyors. Every year I talk to the Wisconsin Society of Land Surveyors because it's important that we get this legal world meshing together with this information and data collecting world, because really a surveyor is part of the land information world, not part of the litigation world, not part of the resolution of land disputes. That's really in the courtroom situation or through mediation, arbitration, but again, through adverse conditions, I guess is the best way to look at it. So what is the role of a surveyor? Number one, maps lines. In other words, you measure lines. How much distance from point A to point B? Locate the monuments. In other words, I take a look at a survey, or I took a look at a legal description, I should say, and it says starting at the old oak tree, then going 150 feet over to the west till I find, the rabbit hole, then from the rabbit hole across to where the creek runs, and then back to the tree. Now, you probably haven't seen a description like that in many, many years, but they're out there. One of the things that I've made it kind of a hobby of mine is to go out and find weird descriptions. And the one I just gave you does exist. It existed in an area of Kentucky where they were describing a parcel of land that was being sold. Sometimes it's claimed that this was land that was being sold by Daniel Boone. I think that's more of a mystery, but the description is probably correct and it was probably used. And it worked because it was all there and it could be followed up. The next thing we look at is, once I've got these maps, I've located these monuments that are referred to in this legal description, I've measured the lines, I've looked at the angles, I've made the determinations. My next responsibility is to create a map. And that map is called a survey map. And there's lots of different kinds of survey maps. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. But understand that it's a surveyor's job to use evaluation and problem-solving techniques to complete those responsibilities of measuring lines, locating monuments, and creating maps. So interpretation and education is certainly a part of the role of a surveyor. A surveyor takes a legal description to the best of their ability. They take the meets and the bounds, if that's what it is, or they take the monument description, they take the measurements that are on and they try to make it fit. Remember, the goal is always to go back to the original survey or the original document that created this parcel of land. You always want to go back to that original document that created what now we're talking about as a piece of land that we're trying to give identity to by creating a survey saying this piece of land is described as commencing at this point, going this far at this angle, then to this monument, then back to this monument, then back to the point of beginning if I was outlining a rectangle, square type parcel. That is the role of a survey, to evaluate and problem solve. Not long ago, we went back to the original document and we found that they were talking about the signal log or the signal tree in a section. And you got to go back historically and try to figure out where that signal tree was. What documentation can you find that helps you locate that? And that's the role of a surveyor. The role of a surveyor to keep field notes and to go back into the old field notes of old surveyors. You know, it's not simply taking some type of a mathematical formula, applying it to a piece of ground and making certain assumptions to make your job easy. That's not the role of a surveyor. And a good surveyor will use their problem-solving skills to complete this job, because the role of surveyor is to come up with a definition through measuring lines, locating monuments, creating a map of what is described on a document of some type that was handed to the surveyor, saying, can you find out where that document is, or that parcel is that's being described by this piece of paper? Remember, the job of a surveyor is not to determine or define proper rights. That's not their role. Those determinations will be made by someone else. The surveyor's job, as I indicated, is to simply take those documents that they are given and try to resolve where those things are located on the ground. So next slide, please. The question becomes, then what is a survey? Well, a survey is a map that is arrived at by engaging in surveying, which is a science, an art, and a profession of determining the positioning points on the surface of the earth and measuring the distance, directions, angles, and elevations between them. Bingo, real simple definition. So that's what a survey is. Now, that is purely a scientific activity in the sense that you're working on the positions or points on the earth. You're going and you're measuring the distance. You're determining what the direction is or what the angles may be. Then you're looking in many cases at elevations also. How far off a given point, usually sea level, have we evolved in an upward or downward direction, so many feet below sea level. Those are things that surveyors do, and they do it by the instruments that are provided to them, by the science that is developed over the years, you know, by the art of surveying. You know, there was a day we used big long sticks and chains to do it, but it's obviously very, very different. And again, all you're doing is you're creating a map, and you're creating that map by engaging in the activity of surveying. Next slide, please. So what is this map? Well, it's a symbolic depiction that emphasizes the relationships. And that's, I think, very, very important for you to understand, is it's a symbol that looks at the space and the objects and the regions that are on that space, okay? So that's what a map is. That's not necessarily what a survey map is, but that's what a map is. So if I took a map of the city of Manitowoc, that map could be a survey. That map could be an illustration that showed height and showed three-dimensional depictions of certain objects or certain activities in the community. I could have a map of all the parks in the city. I could have a map that has a theme of major roads, minor roads, where schools are located, map of how to go from point A to point B, which is, you know, one of the Google map theories of the 21st century. That's what a map is. It's a symbolic depiction that emphasizes something different. So keep in mind that a map is static and it's fixed to a piece of paper or other instrumentality. It could be chiseled on a wall. But other maps are not dynamic, are not static, they're dynamic. That means they're moving, they're interacting, they're completely changing as time goes on. I think and I would have liked to see more of the program that was just before this, but I think the concept is in the 21st century, especially, we're looking at more and more mapping programs that even tell us during the day how roads may move, are looking at property and telling us how property may move. Certainly historical maps. We recently did a project at the university where we looked at one of the major lakes in Wisconsin over a period of about 150 years. And we looked at all the accretion and some of the other, changes of evolution and the other changes that have been made on the property. And we mapped it all out. We mapped it in 10 years. We mapped it in year changes. And we mapped elevation changes and created this dynamic interactive program that told the history of this lake. Now, what's going to be very important with that is as we start to analyze the law with regard to ownership of property, which goes back to remember when I started this whole program today, I was talking about those different aspects. And what I'm talking about here is we're talking about an aspect such as possession. Now, in Wisconsin, for example, if I had owned this piece of property and suddenly through the changes in water patterns, I've lost it. In other words, it's been washed away. It's been through avulsion, it's been moved, and suddenly I don't have that property anymore. Did I really lose the property, even though my document, that if I would talk about it as a static map that I had at one time, says that I own that property, but I look out where that property was now is water. And I know that under the public trust doctrine, that water is owned by the state of Wisconsin, but do I own the land underneath, or do I, as any navigable stream suggests, that the water underneath is owned by the state, or the land underneath the water is owned by the state? And those are the issues that cause interpretation and definition, and becomes very, very important that we don't make assumptions. Because I've heard many people say, well, yeah, you own that land because that land used to be dry land and now it's underwater, but still you own that land. And the answer is that's not true. That's true only if that situation of the flooding was caused by some man-made activity, such as creating a dam or creating a channel or doing something that was authorized by government that resulted in the flooding of land, where the statutes in Wisconsin would clearly point out that if you flooded the land, you have a right to the land underneath the water. Whereas if it's natural, and then the good Lord through flooding, through time, has changed, through accretion or evolution has created a change in the bed of the lake or a change in the bed of the water, then it belongs to the state under the public trust doctrine. And that's why it's so important that land information offices, when we talk about mapping, when we talk about historical mapping, understand that we have to just give people the facts, let them make their own interpretations, or let them, argue those interpretations within the legal paradigms that exist in society. And I think that's really important that you keep that in mind. Next slide, please. Okay, what are the core elements of a map? And again, we're talking about mapping, and we'll go back to surveying in particular, but we're really talking about mapping and what are the core. And the core that you really need to think about is, I just wanted to make, somebody said they had a comment. I was going to make sure that didn't relate to me. Nope. Okay, I'm going to go on. So five core elements. Oh, by the way, questions. Feel free to ask questions anytime, or send questions into Laurel and I'll cover them at the end. I love questions. That's kind of why it's hard for me to talk in this Zoom world. I like to call on people and point at people and ask questions and do that. And I can only see Grace and Tiffany, and I don't want to pick on the two of them. That'll scare the daylights out of them. Anyway, continuing on, 5 core elements. First of all, when you're looking at a map, title is probably one of the most important things you have to establish, because title of the map, and when I mean title of map, it's telling people what is the purpose of the map? In other words, why are we doing this map? So if you have a map that says drainage map, well, what's the purpose? Well, the purpose of the map is to show where the drainage flow is, to show where the contours of the water flow. And if it's a stormwater management map, it'll show where the stormwater goes. You know, in other words, look to the title. And those of you that create maps, make sure you're explicit when you do create a map. And if the map is of parks in the city, then say map of parks in the city, because what it means that it isn't is it isn't a survey map. It isn't going to be held up as this is the correct acreage of the park, or this is the correct dimension of the band shell on the park. It is a map of parks. And it's relatively, all it's doing is showing you where the parks are in, you know, perspective to other pieces of roadways, other buildings in the community. So that's why the basic information piece you always want to look on a map is, what is its purpose? What's the defined purpose of this map? And maps have hundreds of thousands of different purposes. And you know that, and I know that. The second thing you look at when you look at a map is you look at the legend. And what I mean by the legend, and I think most of you know this, the purpose of the legend is also sometimes called the key. You know, it explains what symbols there are on the map and what those symbols represent. You know, little peaks on a map may represent mountains. Little squiggly lines that are blue may represent rivers. Little triangles may represent cell towers. Little black lines may represent certain kinds of roads. Little parallel lines may represent railroads. In other words, the legend is what tells you, when I look at this map, what am I seeing? And again, you go back to the purpose of the map, then you go to the legend, and you put those two together. They tell you what you can use this map for. What's the purpose of the map? What is it? What information is it giving you? And that's what the information can be used for when you go back to the title. The second thing that we see on maps, and this is where we're starting to get more specific now, is what we call grids. And grids on map really represent geographic situations, the latitudes, the longitudes used to locate specific items. So I can show you a map of, I'll pick a new city, I can show you a map of Wapaka and say, here's a map of Wapaka. And people say, well, where's Wapaka? Is it just the other side of Eau Claire? Or is it south of Racine? But if I give you a map that's grid of the state of Wisconsin, you'll see that Wapaka, you know, basically is just between Stevens Point and Appleton. We can show it by longitude, latitude. Where does it fit in the whole world picture, or in the whole state of Wisconsin picture, or in the whole East Central Wisconsin picture? Where does it fit? That's what grids are for. They mark specific locations so that people can identify and find those in respect to other places. And it's a universal system that makes it work. And that's why it's important, because the gridding system, whatever your grid structure is referencing a universal system, so that I can take my little map and I can put it down in somebody else's bigger map, and I can still locate the specific location of the item that's gridded out and it's put in those squares. You know, I can find out that in this area of the park, which I can figure out where that area of the park is through the grid, you know, 1 inch represents a certain amount, or I can go my longitude, my latitude. I can find out where the big tree is, where the marker is. Again, this is the type of thing that'll help us when we're taking a survey or a legal description of a piece of property, and we can figure out where it is. The other aspect of a map that's very important is direction, because without direction, you have no orientation. Directions are just absolutely necessary. You know, you look at a map, you look for the compass rose, which, you know, is a symbol that sits on the side of the map that tells you which way is north generally. And then you can figure out where south and where east and where west is. And you can work off of that symbol so that you know exactly where the consistency of the cardinal directions are on the map. And it's really important that you do have that on a map, again, because it provides proper orientation to when you're looking at how do I go from point A to point B. But more than that, it can create consistency. So I can take this map with its grid, with its legend, with its direction now, and I can compare it to other maps and I can put it together. The final and probably the last element we're going to look at is called scale. And that's the relationship of map to reality. We draw maps all the time. And don't tell me you've never doodled on a piece of paper and you've drawn out a map and you've kind of said, you know, this is where I'd like to put. I used to in high school, I swore I should have been an architect because I would, some of the more boring classes, you know, like geometry or physics, I'd sit in my classroom and I would sketch out building plans and I would put dimensions. And I remember I showed it to one of my teachers and they laughed. They said, because that house won't, you can't build a house like that. And I said, why not? Well, the scale you have is all wrong. You can't put a cantilevered wall out that far, it'll tip over. And well, that's what scale does for us, because it brings our maps to reality. It says that the reality on the ground is that this is a distance of 1 mile. So when I show this road, and that road is half the distance of that 1 mile scale, I know it's a half a mile of road. I look at a map and I'm trying to figure out where the construction is. That's, you know, we're in construction season here in Wisconsin. We look at a map, we look at the scale, we can tell, even if we don't know the area, how far can I go down Highway 151 before I reach the detour? And it's that kind of scaling and that bringing to reality that really helps us, you know, accomplish the goals of mapping. Now, next slide, please. There's other elements that we put on maps that are really important. And color, we use color a lot. And we go back to the legend. We may say green means conservation district, red means residential districts, blue means commercial district. In other words, we use color to create meaning and to create emphasis in our diagrams. And again, I'm not talking about coloring a whole, you know, having a black map, a red map, a green map. I'm talking about using color to give the visual connotation of some of the viable information that's found on that map. And that's what it's for. Is it required? No. Is there anything magic about color? In other words, can I look up some document that says if you use green, that means agricultural. If you look up blue, that means commercial. The answer is no. You can use color to do what you want for the purpose of what you want. Remember, I went back to what's the title of your map? What's the purpose of your map? And you can use color to do that. And you can put it together with your legend so people can see that. Now, the next thing I look at is, and this should be on every map, any map that's going to be used for any real purpose should identify who put that map together. Now, the scribbling we do on our own time, forget it. But if you've done a map, it's very, very important, if it's going to be used for any purpose other than your own personal use, that you put your name on it, you sign off saying, yes, this is my map. Yes, I did this. Because the person that looks at that map and wants more information, where are they going to go? They're going to go back to you. Now let's take to our real world, the world we live in. I go into the courthouse. I look up a certificate of survey. I better know who the surveyor was. I want to see that surveyor's name on that map, because I may have questions. I may look at it and say, I don't really think that building was located there. I want to call up that surveyor and say, did they really measure that building out, or is this a guess? In other words, I want to challenge some of the information that's there. And the idea of the author of the map is going to be able to person I can contact and find things out. Timing is also extremely important in mapping. And I watch people not do this a lot, but it's so important. What date and what time did you do this? Because again, I live in a world of water. Water rights is one of the biggest things I study on a regular basis. And, you know, where the water existed in January compared to where the water existed in late August can be very, very different. Shorelines can change. Ice flows can change all big, large aspects. Lake Michigan, if anybody studies Lake Michigan and the changes over the last several years, it's important to know what year this map was drawn of the dunes, so that we know relative to the levels of the lake, what are we really seeing here? And that's not just true of big bodies of water. If you go to northern Wisconsin right now, you're going to find a lot of lakes are very, very low. And if you looked at the lake now, or you saw a drawing of that lake now, you may believe, just based upon that survey or that map of the lake, that you've got 50 feet of frontage, or 50 feet of sand, let's say, from your shore, from the green area to where the water starts, when in reality that 50 feet is really is under what we call a high water mark. But if the map doesn't identify the high water mark and it just identifies what's there, you're not going to know that. But I'm going to know that if I see a map that was done in the summer of, I'm trying to remember what year that was, it's probably 18 or 19, when the lakes were really bad in northern Wisconsin. And if somebody did a visual, for example, I had a situation not too long ago where somebody flew a drone over a lake and took that picture that the drone took and did a map based upon the drone's picture. I mean, talk about taking data on some of the things we can do now. But the reality was they made that lake look much smaller and gave the impression on the lots that were being sold that they were much larger than they really were. It created a misconception when it was marketed for the property. And again, if you would have been at the Register of Deeds office and somebody brought that picture into you, or the land information office, somebody brought that picture into you and said, here, this is a lake, this is a lot I'm looking at buying. And they looked at another thing and said, oh yeah, that's lot 21 of the Element subdivision. Yep, that was platted about 1942, but yeah, they're finally selling those lots off. It may not even be close to the lot that's on that 1942 plat of that area because of all the changes that could have been made. So it's important to know where you're at. Another aspect of, or another thing you can add to what I call geographic maps, are orientations. And what this really does is, remember, we talked about direction. We have the direction that says, okay, this is, you know, north, this is south, this is east, this is what. Well, orientation is entirely different. It expands that concept of direction. Expands they say the elevations can be shown. This map is orientated from someone that is standing at sea level. This map is orientated for someone that's standing on top of the highest hill in Wisconsin. In other words, you want to look at that expanded directional information. Again, it's useful. It makes the map much more beneficial for many, many purposes that you may have. The other thing you should put on maps is what I call labels and symbols. Again, remember, go back to the title. And the other thing you talk about on labels and symbols is you have symbols that show where, again, you'll waterfront, where's the public landing symbol on the map, where in the water may be shoals that you have to watch out for, where we just had someone brought in a map of, I just saw it on TV the other day at Lake, I think it was Lake either Mendota or Monona, where they're mapping all of the materials at the bottom of the lake. What a very useful map. And of course, labels and symbols are what these masses you're seeing under the water through this pictorial representation of the bottom of the lake is extremely valuable. And it, again, that map has direction. It has orientation. In that case, I'm sure it was signed. It uses different colors to show depths of water. That's all information that can be very, very helpful. So, I mean, those are the elements of the maps, and those are the things that you really want to look for. Next slide, please. So we've talked about maps. Now we're going to talk about something else. We're going to talk about GIS. And I really have all the trepidation in the world talking to a group of GIS specialists about what GIS is. But let me tell you what those of us that practice law, for example, think GIS is and what we see the purpose is. And also, quite frankly, what the government has defined the purpose to be. GIS is a system or framework of gathering, managing, analyzing data that is rooted in the science of geography. Break those words down. GIS is a system. Now, what's a system? I mean, it's an organized way of doing things. That's what a system is. Framework. In other words, it's got certain standards. It's got certain things that are done at certain places. It gives a orientation so that anybody can take this data, put it together in a certain way that's already been defined as part of a system and a framework. For what purpose? For number one, gathering information. Number two, managing that information. And number three, analyzing that information. That information is called data. And it's all based on geography, the science of geography. So it's all based on dirt. It's based on soils. It's based upon water. It's based upon everything that forms the world of geography, the world of land mass, water mass, the things that you and I would refer to as real estate, and the inherent properties that tie into real estate. And in our world, that whatever that means is that means things that are attached to the ground, or things that are attached to the water or the base of the bottom of the lake, or whatever the case might be. That's what GIS is. It's a system. And it's a system that gathers, manages, and analyzes data. Keep that in mind, because we're going to come back to that. What's the goal of the GIS system? It's to gain actionable intelligence from all types of data. The whole purpose of GIS is to give data that scientists can use, people like yourselves can use, to come to certain conclusions based upon the data, to put together different matrices that people can look at. So you're taking data and you're not interpreting the data, you're managing, you're gathering it, and you're analyzing the data in the sense that, yeah, this fits in this category, this fits in that category, all under the basis of the GIS system. Because the system, the GIS system, allows you to visualize data as a map. It allows you to put it on a piece of paper, put it in a computer program, put it somewhere that it allows you to do mapping. It allows you to visualize patterns of this scientific geographic information. That's what GIS is. It's really a system that allows you to take data that we gather all the time, put it together, allow you then as a perceiver of this data to analyze and visualize the data in patterns that are meaningful to you. Next slide, please. So what do you do once the data is collected? Well, you can use it to make maps that one, communicate, perform analysis, share information, solve complex problems. I did a lot of research and study before I ever put this program together, because I really wanted to understand the GIS data collection system and what it can be used for and what it is being used for. You know, what you really have to do is you have to go back in history to probably the 1840s, 1850s, when the Northwest Territory was mapped. And basically young men would go out and they would stake their chains and survey markers, and they would map out the whole state of Wisconsin, Michigan, Illinois, Iowa, Minnesota, throughout this Northwest Territory. That really was the GIS of the 1800s. It was the system that was used to go out and collect information about the geography, and we'll stick to the state of Wisconsin, where surveyors and their crews went out and they mapped, they recorded, they took field notes on everything they discovered. And then they created, using the system that had been established by the government, using the system to create parcels. You know, the Northwest quarter, I mean, to create all the sections, to create all the towns in the state of Wisconsin, for example, but really throughout the whole Northwest Territory. That whole government operation of mapping, that whole government operation of collecting data, of building this huge mass of geographic information that became part of the whole system we use today to identify property, was based on what I would call the GIS of the 1800s. Well, now we've got a different system, because now we have electronics. Now we have the ability to use satellites. Now we have the ability to put lysimeters into the ground that can measure in the ground data with regard to the geography of the land that's underneath. And we have all these tools, and all these tools come together in the GIS system. And so once we have all that data together, what do we use it for? Well, we can identify problems. We can monitor change from one year to the next. We can do forecasting. We can manage and respond to different issues that arise. We can set priorities. We can understand tasks. You know, in the materials that I put together, the written materials for today's program, I go into a lot more detail of what you can do. But what GIS creates is a spatial data, this system that allows us to take information and put it together in different ways to solve different problems. So if someone says to you, I need to know how much water is going to be consumed from the Chippewa flowage over the next 5 years, based upon the patterns of the change in the water conditions over the last 25 years. We can do GIS data to figure that out. We can go back and we can collect data, and we can put it together. We can put it into the computerized programs we now have that take that data together. They can tell us what the changes have been, what the changes are likely to be, by putting together different paradigms that go into the GIS information. And then we can forecast, we can use all of that information. What the GIS is not just that thing we can go online and look up and say, oh, I'm going to look at the GIS map for the county of Taylor. It's so much more than that. And I think that's important to understand. But it's also important to understand that what it is it's data. It's data that if you don't put it together in a certain way, it doesn't do anything. Some of you may not know, but we use GIS data to show automobile accidents. Where is the most likely place to have an automobile accident? Where should we put a roundabout? We use GIS data to do that. We look at information about traffic patterns by collecting certain GIS data. What else do we use? Well, we've looked at it in the Mississippi River, the barge traffic. We're looking at reliction and accretion along the Mississippi right now with hundreds of thousands of GIS pictures. The data has been put together to do that. In the state of Wisconsin, that's vital to cities like Prairie du Chien, DeSoto, some of the other cities that depend upon the Mississippi and the changes in the patterns of the river, and also what it does to your shoreline and the other aspects. So we can predict, you know, when Villa Louis is going to be flooded next. We can use the data that we have. Managing events, GIS data, it manages events. Probably the biggest thing we're seeing now is the use of GIS data to track a tornado, to track a hurricane. That's all based upon GIS data, geographic information systems putting together to put that to accomplish tasks. And again, it has lots and lots of purposes. But what I want to point out for today's presentation or today's information is its primary purpose is to do what you need to have done. In other words, it's to collect the data so that if you say, I need to know is it a good idea to buy this land to be used for a park? Or when somebody comes in and says, I would like to do a development, do you have any land in the city? I just, as a city attorney, I've got asked this the other day, does the city have any land that's available? And I said, sure. And they look at a map and it shows all the parcels that are owned by the city. And they go, oh, here's a really huge parcel. And I said, yeah, but would you like the GIS data on that parcel? Well, what do you mean? We've got data that shows what the history of that parcel is, which goes back about 150 years. We'll show you that parcel was once a lake. We can show you that there's some subterranean problems with that because we've done studies on that land area there. In other words, there's all this data that can show that people may or may not know, but it's all available, and that's what the GIS system is all about. It's not just about creating a map that people could look at to try to figure out who owns 3525 Scott Street in the city of New Berlin. That's not its purpose. It's much, much more than that. So it's important that you take a look at that because that's what GIS data is about. It's this very, very useful tool. Next slide, please. And here's what I've really been trying to get to. How do I compare land surveying with GIS? And I think the most important thing to understand is they really are different, and they really do have different purposes. The whole purpose of a land survey is to identify what actually exists on the land. In other words, I'm a land surveyor. I take what's given to me, which is usually a legal description of some type. I go out to the property using the systems that tell me where the location of this property is. Sometimes those are good, sometimes those are really tough, and I got to do some interpretation. But I go to find where those points are. I go out there looking for the monuments. I go out there looking for the distances. I go out there looking for the angles. I go out there looking for the information, and then I map it out. That's what I do with a land survey. What can GIS do? I can do a lot more than that. It can provide me 3D imaging. It can provide me historical data of how that property has been used. It can provide me retrospective views of how that property has been changing over the years, how it's likely to change given climate changes throughout the world. A lot of that is all GIS data that can be put into land surveying. So what I think I'm trying to say to you is land surveying is for the purpose of identifying some parcel of land or piece of land. Be careful with it, word parcel. Whereas GIS has a much broader use. But one of the uses of GIS is not, I repeat, is not to identify the legal description of a parcel of land. You don't take and put in a legal description to identify a GIS set of data because the data is already there. And the GIS system is simply putting all that data together so you can pull out your useful parts of that data. It's not designed as a tool to create maps in the sense of, create deeds, to create transfer documents. That's not the purpose of GIS. And I think it's real important that people understand that. It's not there to create the property tax assessment. That's not its role. And it really is not intended to be used for that purpose. So, next slide, please. So which one do you use? I mean, what am I using? And where am I going? What is really important is understanding what your goal is and where you're trying to get to. first of all, what's a parcel map? I've kind of slipped over that. Parcel map is another document, and the purpose of a parcel map is simply to assist the county in identifying a real estate parcel, piece of land for tax purposes. I mean, that's the purpose of a parcel map. Parcel map really has the significance of a parcel map is determine what the assessor should go out there and look at in order to create an assessment for property tax purposes. That's what a parcel map is about. Parcel map, it does not define what the actual right of possession is. It doesn't define what the actual right of income is. It doesn't define any of those aspects of what we call property rights. The worst thing in the world that a person can do is say this parcel map tells someone what their property rights are, because it doesn't. There's nothing in the definition of parcel map. There's nothing in the history of the United States that suggests a parcel map tells you what your legal rights are as to a piece of land. That's not its purpose. Its purpose is to create a methodology for collecting real estate taxes on an equitable basis. Now, it'll use survey maps, it'll use other tools, even GIS, to create the parcel that ultimately will be the basis, and recognizing that the public has a right to question that tax bill, saying this parcel says there's 8 acres here. There's not 8 acres here. Here's my deed. My deed says that I only got 4 acres. I know your parcel map shows 8, but look at my deed, measure it out, go to your meets and bounds, it's only 4. And that's, nobody's at fault if the parcel map says it's 8 and the deed says it's 4. That's not anybody's fault, because the purpose of the parcel map was only to establish what would be the real estate assessment for tax purposes and other governmental purposes. And everyone has the right to challenge them, because they're not inchoate. They're not, the gospel of the county. That's not where it's at. It's just simply, I don't like to use this word, but it's simply the best guess at times. And that really gets to be important. I know there's a bunch of questions coming in, and I'll finish these 2 points and I'm gonna go back to those questions. The ones I kind of glanced at look really good. Okay, understand then the parcel map, that's its purpose. What's the purpose of the survey map? Well, the survey map's purpose is to take a legal description from a piece of paper, generally. In our electronic day, I could say it's digital information also. But the purpose is to say, if I go from this legal description, it says starting at, and it'll give me a place to start, the northeast corner of section 22. Okay, the state of Wisconsin has been surveyed down to where I can find the original northeast corner of the original northeast corner, and that I can start with, and that's my job. My job is to go back to the original parcel or the original monument and work from that original monument for that piece of property. Now, that's what a legal description is. A legal description is to take a legal description that's provided and survey that out using the meets and bounds descriptions, the distances, the angles, the measurements, all those factors, which I talked about way back when we were talking about what is a survey map, and then create a map of a piece of property, and then put on that piece of property what's there. Here's an encroachment, here's a house, here's a stream, whatever physically is on the ground. That's the purpose of a survey map. Now, some people say to me, well, hold it, but a survey map tells me what I own. No, it doesn't. It doesn't tell you what you own. Your deed tells you what you own. A survey map only says, I took your deed, I went and mapped it out, and here's what it came out to be. Now, if nobody contests that, you're fine. But a survey map is only a recitation of what a document said and the surveyor's attempt to find those points on the land that they discover. That's why you can have two surveyors. I'll give you a classic example. There's a lake that I was working with up north where one surveyor started from one point because that's where the survey started that they were using. Another surveyor started from another point, which he really shouldn't have used. He should have used what the first surveyor used, but they worked down what had been an old plat back from the 1940s, 1930s, 1940s, of a lake. And when they got to a point with the lot they were surveying, one surveyor had it 16 feet on one side, one surveyor had it, so you had an overlap of basically 32 feet. Both surveys were absolutely correct, depending upon where you started your point. And there was nothing wrong with the survey. They did follow every, direction they should have. But again, we get that done. And so Parcel A says, well, I own, 16 feet on your land. Parcel B says, oh no, I own 16 feet on yours. We got a 32-foot differential here. The only one they can resolve that was a court of law, and the court did. In that case, the court pretty much played Solomon and cut it down the middle, but they did it predicated upon possession. They did it predicated upon actual use, possession, which is one of the elements that can be used in deciding where a parcel is. And that's what people have to understand, that determining exactly what you own is oftentimes very, very different from what a survey says and certainly what a GIS map says, or from what a parcel map says, because the parcel maps and the GIS maps are not created for the purpose of telling you what you own. Shoot, look at the very document that you come to when you open up that map. And I've said this before, it says, this is not to be used to determine what you own. What you own is based upon there's 14 factors. If you can have fun, read Brown on property boundary disputes, and they'll tell you the 14 factors, and survey is number 4 on the list. We have actual monuments first, we have possession, we have all kinds of factors before we get to survey. And I think that's really important, because so many people in the world of land information say, well, here's my certified survey, that tells me what I own. No, it doesn't. It tells you what's on the ground that some surveyor found. What you own is basically predicated on the deed, but the person that sold you that property can only give you what they owned. And if they didn't own what's on that deed, they can't give it to you. And that's why we often have to take those to court, or, which is the most wonderful way, two neighbors get along and they agree, and they create a new original document called a certified survey map. You own lot 1, you own lot 2, and life goes on. It's wonderful. And we use the data we get from a GIS map to do it. We use the data that we have from the survey maps from previous years to do it. But we create a new description that's blessed by a court, and it goes on. And that does become the incidence of ownership. That does become your property then. And that's the way of resolution. That really are only 2 ways: 2 people agreeing, or a court deciding. And I don't mean just 2, you could have 4 people, whatever the conflict is. But in other words, agreement or by resolution in a court. And that's important to understand, because none of these devices that we talk about, not a parcel map, not a survey map, not a GIS map, can really define a person's legal ownership rights or the legal land boundaries rights. They just can't. They can give evidence, they're sometimes wonderful evidence of what you own, but not the absolute. There's no slam dunk, so to speak, because so much of it's based upon facts and circumstances, historical use, monuments, lots of factors, accretion, reliction. I mean, all those things can change a lot of what you think you own versus what you really do own. So as we look at that, my final point here is, you have to really sit and look at that, because they're all integrated together, and you have to use all those things together to get to this concept of ownership, because ownership and legal rights are oftentimes very different from what is a parcel map what's a survey map and what's a GIS map. Again, go back to what the purpose is. Purpose of a parcel map is really to identify something that can be used for tax purposes. The purpose of a survey map. Purpose of a survey map is to identify what this legal description, this document that you have, says you own using the most modern techniques of surveying. What's the purpose of a GIS map? The purpose of a GIS map is a collection of data and a presentation of that collection of data for the purposes for which it's intended, which are basically scientific geographic purposes. That's why GIS was created. Do we use it for a scientific geographic? Sure, we use it to utilize the computer, because GIS has allowed us to put maps up on computers that give people a good idea of where this parcel is and where that parcel is, but it doesn't define who owns what. And I'm probably beating this horse to death, but there's 17 questions. And, maybe I should take a quick look at them. Maybe they don't mean anything. I see some of them are very humorous. Let's see. GIS is required to put in work for various forms of surveyors and finding that various surveys don't fit together with gaps and overlaps. Yeah, I mean, GIS will be one of the first things in the world that'll give you data that will suggest that your survey maps don't line up, because GIS will take data that's available, whether it's from a satellite impression, whether it's from some other scientific source, that'll say, whoops, there's a problem here, because your dimensions didn't take into consideration that back in, we just had this one, back in 1872, one county decided they didn't want certain land, and so they abandoned the land to the other county. But so many measurements had never, ever changed, even though there had abandonment, and a new county line had been established that only half the people were using. So you have to remember that that's what the purpose of GIS is data. It gives you lots of data to find and deal with problems. Does anyone else often deal with property line disputes because of this? Well, I would presume that many of you deal with property line disputes because people look at the GIS. I get this all the time in my practice. People will come with their GIS map and says, look, I own this land. I go, no, you don't. Oh yeah, I do. Look at, I own this land. Look, I took this, and the county gave it to me, and by golly, they know what they're doing. And I say, no, read the introduction. It says you can't use this. Well, my surveyor said I could use it. Well, that isn't true. And you all know that. I'm probably beating a dead horse to death, but I think it's important that we recognize that GIS has lots and lots of data that's very, very useful, but it can be very, very confusing to the person that doesn't know what the data really represents and really what its purpose is. And that's what's dangerous. I started off this whole program talking about you have to know what data is useful and what data isn't useful. You have to know what you know and what you don't know. And what you certainly want to communicate to other people is the concept that the data that is out there, if used correctly, is very helpful, but it has to be used correctly. I'm trying to see if there's lots of you giving great information. Yes, GIS is just data, representation, general. Maybe I'm speaking to the audience that knows more than I do about this. A lot of it took, and we know that people use their county. Yeah, the motto is always get a survey. The good thing about getting a survey, and any of you working in like a registered deeds office or the property lister's office, when you tell people go get a survey, is you shift the blame away from the county. And I always tell surveyors, tell them to get a lawyer, because that shifts the blame away from the surveyor and onto the lawyer. Lawyers have the most malpractice insurance, so always push it off onto them. I think that's really important, because then you can't be blamed. There's some great comments here, and I'm sure you're all looking at these. Yeah, title insurance company, I'll just end with this one, then I'll go back to my presentation. Title insurance companies rely on surveys, and they take the risk. And that's why it's good to have a risk taken over by having a surveyor do a survey, then getting the title insurance company, because the title insurance company is saying is the surveyor followed all the requirements of doing a required survey, we'll take the risk. We'll insure over the surveyor making a mistake. And that's a great practice. Again, don't you working in land information take the risk, push it. And title insurance is a great way to share the risk. And I'm sure there's some of you that work in the title insurance industry that understand that you are taking somewhat of a risk, because survey maps are not the ultimate authority. The ultimate authority is that person sitting, on the dais in front of you called a judge. That's the ultimate authority in the United States anyway. In other countries, it's the guy with the biggest gun who's in authority. That being said, we'll keep out of politics for a while here. Next slide, please. Okay. Well, I probably covered half of this just talking normally. What are parcel maps? They're generally a governmental tool. Parcel maps also known as property maps or tax maps. And I know this from my last conference with you, that I will never, ever call anyone a tax lister again as long as I live. You're a property lister. I understand it. I get it. And it sure made my life a lot easier, because you're not listing taxes, you're listing parcels. And if the tax department, the treasurer, wants to use that, that's good. And that's how we identify parcels. And really, it's a good system if you believe in real estate taxes. And they are, for the most part, quite accurate. And they're certainly accurate enough for assessing taxes. I'll give you just a very personal example. I had a neighbor with boundary line dispute. My neighbor said, I own 15 feet of your land, and I've got a survey, and I know the rules. I've been taking care of it. And I said, great. Well, I went over to and of course they called it the tax lister. I went over to the property lister's office, and I told them to change it. And I said, great. Well, that means you just lost 15 feet. And I said, no, what it means is I'm paying taxes on 15 less feet of frontage. That makes me happy. I still own the land that I own, but if you got the property lister to change it so those 15 feet are going to be taxed to you, that's wonderful. Well, that'll prove that I own it. And of course, I know full well there's nothing in the law that says if I pay property taxes on something, I own it. Shoot, there's all kinds of properties I'd go pay the taxes on if that meant I could own it. That's not the law, and that's not the way the system works. So I give you that as a very practical, real example of where a tax parcel, as I said to the person, go ahead, you can change it. I don't care, because it doesn't mean anything. It just means how much taxes you're going to pay. And my taxes did go down and theirs did go up. I love it. And it is a source for government to use. I watch people put on real estate descriptions when they sell property, offers to purchase. They're selling tax parcel 1, 2, 3, and 4. I'm going, you're not selling tax parcels. You're selling real estate. Well, yeah, but the tax parcel describes the real estate. No, it doesn't. But for purposes of offer to purchase, it's probably as good as I'm selling 1, 2, 3 Maple Street. I understand that. But just understand, and I'll tell clients this, that unless you actually have a survey that's insured by the title insurance company, you're really not guaranteeing yourself much by using a tax parcel number. And it leads also to a lot of transposition and other things that can create problems later. Next slide, please. So understand that there's a whole initiative out there to make sure that people know and understand what the purpose of tax parcels are. And I think it's really important that you do recognize this and you do understand this. And I'm sure most of you do. So I give this to you because it's there, it's available. It's a nice thing to read. Next slide, please. So as we kind of get towards the end of this, I want to just do a couple things here. Remember, when you're looking at comparative uses, surveys give you the most information. Certified survey is great because that's the one that the title companies will look for. It's very accurate. GIS gives you the most data, the most observations, the most research material. If you're writing a thesis, go for the GIS data because you'll know a lot more about the property than you will from looking at a survey. It's hard to gather all the GIS data because it's all over the place. unless you're a GIS specialist and you have all the tools. And some of you are, I know you are. And counties are becoming very attuned to using GIS for multiple purposes. But remember, it isn't a tool for telling somebody what they own. Parcel maps, we've talked about that. Remember that surveys are often used in court to help judges. So survey maps, I can't tell you the number of judges that said, we had the property surveyed, and the surveyor testifies, yes, I went out and I took that. The judge says, okay, then why are we here? And then people like me say, well, that's not the only evidence, Your Honor. That's only a piece of the evidence. What do you mean? Survey is a survey. And I said, no, that's not. And then I always have to give 5 or 6 examples of where surveys didn't really match up with the actual property, and the case law that says that's not true. But it's important to understand that the vast majority of society believes that a certified survey, in fact, the vast majority of surveyors believe that once they do a survey, that means that's what you own. Not true. It's great evidence, but it's not the ultimate. It's not the final authority. Next slide, please. So I've got several examples from cases that I've dealt with, and I'll try to give you just some of these just for some fun. But parcel map, I had a parcel map that said there were 115 feet of frontage. And so the person bought, and they bought their parcel, and it was a lakefront property, and the contract said that they're paying $20,000 a frontage foot. So they bought the parcel based upon the parcel map, and it was 115 feet, so they bought it that. Then they went ahead and surveyed after they bought it. Found out surveys show there's only 110 feet. So 5 times 20, for those of you that need to do the math, they spent $100,000 for something that they wouldn't have had to pay under the terms of their offer to purchase if they had done the survey map before the transaction rather than after the transaction. I mean, there's an example of where you can find a lot of difference. And that is $100,000 difference. You know, on $1 million transaction, that's significant. And I think you should keep that in mind. I will tell you another place where you see problems. USDA, if you're on any kind of a program, or forest land management programs, or USA programs where you're getting government payments based upon acreage. Remember that USDA has their own system, and they use GIS data to come up with the legal description of the property and the acreage. Oftentimes I tell farmers, you look at theirs and then you look at your actual acreage, and most farmers have surveys or they've got a good idea. I said, you know, if theirs is higher, you don't have to correct the government. If theirs is lower, it's to your advantage to go and have a survey done, because some of those programs may be paying as much as, you know, $5,000 an acre per year or $6,000 an acre per year. In over 20 years, that could be a lot of money if you lost 1 or 2 acres. So that's another place where I say there's an example of knowing what tool to use. Lack of accuracy in angles and dimensions in parcel maps cause all kinds of misunderstandings. Most parcel maps like nice square corners, and most surveys aren't that square. And it can make a huge difference. There was a case that came out of New York State. It was a brilliant case. But what it did is it ended up with a road being constructed across a parcel of land after they had done eminent domain and taken land by using a parcel map to determine what land they were going to buy or what they were going to get. They paid off this one farmer for this parcel of land. They paid him like $600,000. They put the road in, and then of course after that it was surveyed and found out the state bought a parcel of land that they weren't using for the road because the parcel map was wrong. It had inaccurate angles on it, and they had to buy the land that they actually did use. And the court said, no, you own both pieces. And the farmer said, fine, yeah, I don't need that land. Shoot, $600,000. I don't need to farm anymore because you just paid me another $600 for this one. And that's a kind of an interesting case. And that's, of course, why it was in the books. But it's an example of what things can go wrong. The other thing I think is really, really, really important is when you look at a parcel map and you think you know where the road appears. There's one up in Rusk County. It's just hilarious. I've used it in several programs that I've done with the surveyors. If you look at the parcel map on the GIS map, it'll show the road, and it looks like the road is 10, 15, 20, 30 feet above the section line, yet the legal description says they own to the section line. So theoretically, the road, they own land on the other side of the road. And of course, you tell people that and they go bananas, but you say, well, here, look at this map, look at this GIS map and you start all kinds of conflict between the parties. Well, the reality was the GIS map was incorrect because it made certain assumptions when it was being put together. No blame to Rusk County. Don't anybody out there who's from Rusk County say, but it's because I could have picked a different county and said the same thing. But really, that's one of those things that I find that people get all bent out of shape and think they own. That and waterfront, those are the two biggest ones. Next slide, please. Oh, these are 4 cases. I think I'm supposed to be done pretty quick. No, I got to 3:30, don't I? Yeah. Okay, let me take a look at this. This is a case that I think you should look at. This is a case that came out of, well, I'm calling it the Princeton case. This is where a surveyor went out and discovered what he believed was a parcel of land that did not, had no ownership, basically suggesting that this parcel had not been conveyed by one party forever. But in examining it, he found an old plat map that had been developed somewhere around 1930, 1940, somewhere. It doesn't matter exactly what the case was. So he figured that the land, because there had been a proposed plat of this area, that it must belong to the city. And he convinced the city that what they should do is they should quit claim this property because they weren't using it. They were never going to put a road through. They should quit claim it to this neighbor who this surveyor was working for, because there was land that obviously belonged to the city by versus of this old plat map. So the city does, quit claim deed. The person transfers the property and the guy starts building a fence. Well, the other neighbor goes, hold it. No, that's no man's land. We've used that land to get back to our property in the back. It's much more convenient than using our driveway, and you can't block that land off. We've been using that for years. Guy said, oh yeah, I got a deed from the city that says that I own that. And of course, the person goes down to the city and says, how, you can't sell that land. You don't own that land. And they said, oh yeah, it was platted, and they show him the plat, and the guy comes to me, I do the research and figure out, no, this is just a piece of land that has never been transferred. It's been sitting on the books for years. Now, if you look at the GIS or map, it shows that that parcel belongs to the person who now has title to it, theoretically from a city deed. If you look at the tax records, it clearly shows that that parcel of land has never been taxed, for at least not since the I'm pretty sure it was the 1930s. If you look at the tax records, if you look at survey maps of the area, which have been done, and you follow those out, yep, it's no man's land. But of course, the city gave a deed to it. And the surveyor said, yep, that's correct. That's where it should be. In this case, the property lister who went back and was showing a picture of this proposed plat of the area of the city said, oh yeah, if it wasn't ever platted, that means it belongs to the city. That's why it's not showing up on the GIS. Yeah, the city owns that land. And that's what I talk about. You've got to be careful not to do interpretations. because unless you research the whole case, you really don't know what's true. Another example, this is a Missouri case where the parcel map that was used was accurate down to about a 50-foot range on a lake. And the result was that this parcel, which was sold as lakefront property in downtown St. Louis, actually, riverfront, I should call it, not lake, riverfront, actually had no riverfront, that the 50-foot stretch between the house and the water was really the property of the state, because at one time, the river had been about 20 feet further inland, and there had been a levee there that had been subsequently torn down because a new levee had been built upstream. And this area was kind of a water area that had been blocked off. And this case resulted in about what'd they say, $1.2 million differential in value. You know, that's the kind of thing that wakes you up when you're looking at somebody using one tool versus another. The Tennessee case is, you notice I'm trying to avoid Wisconsin. The Tennessee case is a situation where a surveyor who was busy and real busy just took the parcel map, measured the parcel map at the courthouse, figured out the dimensions, did a survey map based upon the parcel map that was available to him at the courthouse. Now you could do it online, of course, and you could use those measuring tools that are available on different programs so that you could figure out from the parcel map. And he did the whole survey based upon a parcel map at the city hall. And of course, he went and had it certified as a certified survey map. And the person bought the property based upon that parcel map, the certified survey map. And lo and behold, somebody else comes along and actually does a real survey and finds out that the property, because it was done incorrectly, is effectively a landlocked piece of property. The value goes from, quite a bit down to basically nothing. The person has to try to buy other land, but the person in this case ended up having to sell his land to the person that discovered the error, because that person was the one that was going to be landlocking him. And the result of that case was a surveyor is no longer surveying, and I'm paid a lot of money, or his insurance company paid a lot of money. And that's where you really have to watch out for this type of thing. The last case was kind of a fun case. It came out of Vermont, that state where there's never anything wrong. And if you go back in history, this is probably one of those states that has more inaccurate measurements, and it really creates all kinds of problems, because you have to go back to the original surveyor's notes in a lot of cases for a lot of the property that's in the mountains, et cetera. And in this case, we had a surveyor and developer that created false documents and false historical documents and provided them to the county, and the county based their records based upon these false documents. And the county created this whole system. And it wasn't until GIS came along and they couldn't validate the GIS data against this land that this developer had used, and the description the surveyor had put together to develop this whole area of this mountainside. And they discovered that there was significant errors. And really that's where they effectively had to go through and try to figure out the rights. And, the developer, of course, lost a lot of money. The surveyor, I'm sure, had lots of legal issues, the problems. But the biggest problem was the county had all this terrible data that they had to erase from their system and recreate and rebuild their whole property listing records, because in this area, because it was all wrong and it was based on bad data. So you can have a significant impact on your local rights and your local property. And that's what I'm trying to point out. This is not some kind of a problem that I just made up in my sleep last night. This is real. I'm dealing with several cases right now where surveys show different things and people are depending on parts. Just had one where the person came up and said, that road is on my property. And I said, is it? And he said, yeah, look at this GIS map. And I said, yeah, but has that been surveyed? I mean, that's right, pretty close. Well, no, this GIS map is correct. I said, you better make sure before you buy that property. No, I'm positive. Well, sure enough, when it turned out, and suddenly I was the bad guy because, I misled him. I'm saying, nope. Thank heavens I had my notes, I had my information. I said, I told you to get a survey. And one of the people here today said that, always say, go get a survey. Because if he had surveyed the property, they would have told him that the GIS map was wrong and he shouldn't be relying on that tax parcel, because that would have, clued him in that there's something wrong there. What clued me in was this driveway he was talking about went to a different house. And he thinks that he's going to be sneaky and he's going to buy this property and then he's going to cut that person off and going to their house. Whenever you see something that on its face looks like this can't be right, you ought to take notice of that too. One of the huge advantages of surveyors is, GIS data can be wrong too. Now, in this case, it may or may not have been. I don't know how the GIS map was created, but I do know that if you walked out there and saw the property like I did, you could tell quickly that there was something wrong, that it just didn't make sense that driveway was in the wrong location. Now, sometimes driveways do get in the wrong location, don't get me wrong, but this was a case where it seemed very obvious, especially when you went down about 120 feet. There was another old driveway off the road, hadn't been used in many, many years, but it was a vacant lot. And so maybe that's, it didn't need to be used. But that's the kind of stuff that observation by a surveyor can be so critical. And looking at field notes, and I know a lot of you that are surveyors go back and read field notes. I've solved more trials with field notes than you'll ever imagine, because field notes are sometimes the very best evidence that you have from a historical perspective, and history is going to prove who owns what and what your property rights are. So next slide, please. So in conclusion, I got to wake Tiffany up there. She's sleeping. But the bottom line is you got to look is knowing what your duties are. Each of you have a responsibility depending on what your job is. As a lawyer, my job is to tell people what the law is. My job is not to survey. My job is not to be able to go out there and create a map of a property. I mean, I've sketched out maps. I can draw legal descriptions. There's programs I can buy and I know how to do it. But it's really important that you understand what your duties are and what your responsibilities is, and know the difference between providing data and providing an opinion, because opinions can become very, very dangerous. I happen to serve periodically as an adjunct city attorney helping out cities that don't have one. And also I've done that as corporation counsel for a few counties in Wisconsin. And I just always will take time to go down to the land office, the information office, and introduce myself and talk about the fact that let's remember that we provide information, we don't provide opinions. That my favorite phrase is you don't get paid enough to get sued for what you say. And I think that's a reality in some of these situations. Now, if you're in the business and you're being paid to give an opinion, research it, get the GIS data, get the survey data, make sure your opinions are couched in the facts, make sure your opinions have the stipulations that you need to do to protect yourself, such as I said when I did when I told that person not to buy that property because the driveway I thought was not on where it belonged when I looked at the GIS map and looked at the property. Observation is important. Number two, remember a survey is only lines, monuments, and angles. That's really all it is. It's a replica or a reproduction of the data that was provided to the surveyor. And it's good. I mean, it's very useful. And title insurance companies have done, if you use the right standards, are going to insure over it. And that's good. That's buying insurance. That's great. Because if there is a property dispute and you've got a title insurance company that's going to pay the bill, great. And they won't, that's be very cognizant of the fact that most title insurance policies say we don't cover for boundary disputes or encroachments or any of this unless you've had a land title survey done meeting our standards. So keep that in mind as you look forward. Number three, remember GIS is only data. And you have to learn how to use it. You have to be trained. And if you're not, you got to find somebody that can, interpret the data and help you with the data. Like I said, I listened to the presentation a little bit before this, and you're in a world that I don't spend time in, but I know if I need GIS data, I do a lot of mining. I work for a lot of mining companies, and I've learned, lisimeters, and I've learned, hydraulics, and I've learned that you have to know where the aquifer is. I've learned a lot of stuff, but I understand that I don't know it all, and I'm not a geologist, and I'm not a hydrologist. And you got to bring the right people in to put the right data together to understand some of the GIS data that's out there too, and don't try to go over your level. Certainly, I'm a lawyer, and everybody thinks lawyers always go over their level, but I'm one that will never do that. Observation, I've talked about this. You don't ever disregard observation. Those of you that actually do have to make opinions and interpretations, don't believe what you see always. Go out and look at it. I found that to be one of the most valuable tools ever, is go take that GIS map, go take that certified survey map and walk to the property, go look at the property, go look and see if those pictures called the maps make sense by what you're seeing on the ground, what you're walking and what you're looking at. Observation is so important. It's so essential. You'll find many, many times that'll trigger something saying something's wrong here. And what you find, and I think this is important to point out, is you find lots and lots of people that try to cover up their mistakes. And it's not me. I didn't do anything wrong. And a lot of times I'll say, no, I didn't say. County surveyors and I sometimes get here. I say, I'm not saying that you did anything wrong. I'm just saying I went out there and this just doesn't make sense. Explain it. Well, somebody else must have. Okay, somebody else did something wrong. But can we correct this? How do we get this corrected? And then we work on that. Everything has its place, and frankly, you should never understand things to be more than just a tool. A survey is a tool, it's evidence. Observation is a tool, it's evidence. Parcel map is a very important tool for tax purposes. It's essential. How else are we going to do it? Unless somebody comes up with a different way, it works, and it works well, because if you don't like it, you can challenge it. It's a system that works well. And GIS is a whole new world, and we don't even have, we haven't even begun to scratch the surface of what all this data that's coming down and being put into this GIS system. It's just like when they went out and mapped, the Northwest Territory. Nobody knew all the information they were going to need about how the lakes, or how the rivers flowed, how the streams flew, and all the different things that turned into transportation, that turned into development, that helped plan out where the railroads would go. These are all things that came from that data that was done by the original surveys of this part of the country. Well, the same thing is true with GIS. We don't know, maybe it's going to be the tool that we use to determine what our spatial ownership is. How much land are we going, or how much air are we going to own? How is that going to be attached to, the new GIS systems that'll determine whether or not we own the land or the air above us? And if so, how far do we own down? I remember as a kid, I said, dig far enough, you'll go to China. Does that mean that somebody from China owns halfway and I own the other half? You don't really know, but of course that's not important. But I'm trying to say is that everything's a tool. Finally, there's never an absolute. The only thing probably is the absolute, and even that can be challenged, is when the judge says this is where the property line is, or this is the map we're going to use, or this is your tax bill because you own this. As I said to my neighbor, you want to pay 15 feet worth of extra taxes? Be my guest. I don't care, because it doesn't change who owns the land. And when I go to sell, I'm going to sell those 15 feet, even if you're still paying taxes on them. Because I know I have a survey map, I can prove it. I've done what I need to do. I understand adverse possession. I understand prescriptive right. I understand all those legal concepts that may try to take that land away from me. And I've made sure that they don't exist. And that's important. So it's all useful. So we're getting down to the end. I could probably talk for another 4 hours, but I don't think that's what I'm allowed to do. But certainly we've got 10 minutes for questions here. I'll see if there's some that have popped up. I said, what does the law say about things like a right to view? I got to move this so I can read it. Like a right to view, or maybe a right to get sunlight for solar panels and things like that. Okay, I just was talking about that. Right now, you have what we call a absolute right from your house all the way north. I mean, or up into the sky. I shouldn't say north, what should I say? You have this, if you extend your property lines and you go straight up into the sky, you have the right. That's your space. Now, the government has given certain airlines the right to fly in your space. The government has taken away the use of certain areas as fly zones. Those are things that, like, just like any other type of government regulation, they've taken away from you. Solar panels, however, you have the absolute right to your space. So the guy next door to you builds a 14-foot, excuse me, let's make it a 14-story building, suddenly takes away your sunlight. Do you have a right? And the answer is no. They can block your sun if the law allows them to block your sun. In other words, if in fact there's no prohibition against building something that takes away someone's light access. Now, major cities, a lot of major cities have rules that say buildings can only be so high. They cannot take away that. So it really depends upon your zoning code and what's there. But a lot of zoning codes are now starting to adopt solar rules. But again, that's a property right that you have, that absolute right, that space above your house, but you don't have a right to your neighbor's space through which those sunlight or those sun rays, and just like your neighbor doesn't have a right to where that sunlight goes through your property. And, that's important to understand. There's no public trust doctrine like there is for water, which says you have a public trust in light. And that's why counties and cities are passing zoning laws that would protect that. Next question, perhaps outside the scope, does the law say about the right to privacy and high resolution? Oh, that's a great one, because again, you cannot fly your drone across the top of my house. I have an absolute right to the airspace above my house, unless somehow the Federal Aviation Administration has created an air corridor, a fly corridor above my house. And I can guarantee you, if they have, then the answer is you're not flying a drone in that, or you're not taking imagery. Now, the problem is the neighbor could shoot down from their property into mine, and the answer is that would be illegal. Now, there's other laws that would prohibit that, and so there's laws that would prohibit anyone from invading your privacy. Privacy is guaranteed, and you can argue that it's in the Constitution according to most of the current justices on the Supreme Court, and I think that'll stay for a while. But the reality is, no, you have your space above you, that's protected. So build your walls high enough and that the neighbors can't look from their property, and you're going to be safe. How about trees or brushes coming over property lines? That's always a fun one. You have the right to cut every single branch that goes across your property. So in other words, somebody plants a tree on the boundary line and that tree has branches that cross over into your property. You can go out there and prune that tree down so that none of the branches extend onto your property. The kicker is you can do that, but if you kill the tree, then you're going to be liable for damaging their property. So my recommendation is, if you're going to do it, have an arborist do it, or have somebody do it that knows. And I generally say, tell the people before you do it, give them a chance to prune the tree, but you have an absolute right. If that tree's extending onto your property, the same is true of rose bushes, lilac bushes, anything, your property line is a straight line. And so, yeah, you've got absolute rights to that. Just you're responsible if you damage the property beyond that. Next question. See, yes, counties and municipalities take aerial photos all the time. Do they do it legally? you better check your ordinances, but generally, unless they have your permission, they should not be flying over your house or flying over your property. The problem is most people don't care, and that's that's the risk they take. It's like the police officer that parks in your driveway to run, radar. Does the police officer have a right to park in your driveway to run radar on the street out in front of you? The answer is no. Do you want to be the one to go tell him he can't? Because then he'll label your car as the next one to be arrested. No harm, no foul is kind of what government uses. And I kind of tell my officers that too when I work with them. Is sunlight lack of roles apply when trees, such as someone plants a tree? No, that's a toughie. Can somebody plant a tree on your property and take away your sunlight? And the answer is absolutely, as long as the tree doesn't extend onto your property. Again, you have that space right above you. You don't have that space that's coming in at the angle. So they can do that. Some cities, especially metropolitan areas, write rules that say you can't do it. You can't plant a tree that takes sunlight away from the neighbor. Can't plant a tree that's more than so many feet high, within so many feet of the lot line. I mean, that's the way that's usually done to prevent that. Yes, Google Maps absolutely, without permission, are creating illegal imagery, and when they're posting it on the web. Google has fought with that, and Google contends that they're not doing it from any of the airspace that belongs to you. They're doing it from satellites, and there is a special rule from satellites. I really believe that you're using imagery from drones, but they're telling us they're not. Many states have given Google and other drone manufacturers the right to go down public roadways, sit on your streets. So if they're flying down the street and that's public street, and they're shooting from the public street or from the public roadway. The other thing that I know that Google will do, if they do want to come out and map areas, they will go house to house and ask permission. But if they're doing it without permission and they're not using a satellite imagery, but they're using drone imagery, and they're coming onto your property or into your airspace to do it, that would be a violation of the law. Probably from their perspective, what's the harm? Because you got to prove harm. And if there's no harm, no fouls is kind of the feeling. The kid that runs through your front lawn committed a trespass, but I guarantee you the sheriff's not going to arrest him. So you've got to be, cognizant of that. Yeah, high-level aircraft are protected by the United States government. The United States government only extends your ceiling, and I don't remember the exact amount, but it's more than you and I are ever going to. In other words, hot air balloons. I have a client who was a hot air balloon, and he had to be very, very careful to get permission to take his balloon below a certain level as he flew across the city or perhaps private property. He'd have to have permission when he got too low from the private property owners. He would know that exact number, but if you know how high a hot air balloon goes, that's kind of what it is. Yes, the FAA is the one that sets the rule of how high. That's why I said the federal government owns that airspace, and they work with states on that. Yes, again, the government has the right to take maps for government purposes, but they don't have a right to put a drone over your house to take pictures of you swimming or bathing. That's not a government purpose. So, I mean, it's like I said, the police officer could park his car in your front yard if he's investigating a crime, but if he's shooting the neighbors driving fast down the road, he doesn't have to be on your property to do that. And you could make an argument. Most people don't, but they can. So I think I talk awfully fast, but I think I've covered most of the questions. Anybody have anything else? Fire away, because I love answering questions. I love interactions. It's a lot more fun at times. And you can tell I like to talk. So this is an area that I like. I mean, I really enjoy working with groups such as this. Land and real estate is my bag, especially recreational properties, waterfront, and government interaction with people.